אחר צהריים טובים לכולם, תודה למי שמצטרף אלינו. אני רואה שסשה כבר נמצא בצד השני של האוקיינוס בקנדה. Welcome, Sasha.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll wait for a couple of minutes more to give a chance to other attendees to register and to hook on.
So that gives me 5 minutes to work on my Hebrew.
Don't think that we are going to discharge you from coming to Israel, because now we are starting this Go webinar thing. Hebrew. בהזדמנות הזו, לפני שאנחנו מתחילים את הסשן, אני רוצה להודות לכם שאתם מצטרפים. זה כנס וירטואלי ראשון, קצת מוזר לי, קצת מוזר לכם, אבל זו המציאות שאנחנו חיים בה. אנחנו נעבור על שאלות שסשה יעלה לנו על מצב השוק בטורונטו. אני אעשה תרגום מפעם לפעם אם צריך לגבי הדברים שהוא אומר. סשה גם יציג לנו פרויקט שאמור להיכנס בשבועיים הקרובים בטורונטו יותר מאוחר. First of all, I'll be happy, Sasha, if you could update us on the current status in Canada, in the GTA, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. What is the situation now in Canada?
So you're looking for more of a broad update, not so much real estate, just general.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think like everywhere in the world, when we did I think a great job as a country, as much as possible. Obviously, this is a very serious set of circumstances. We moved very quickly back in March to kind of instill protocols and lockdowns, and then kind of came out of those with, I think, a very defined recommendation for interaction. We didn't kind of just go right back to normal. There was a lot of protocols that were set up with regard to social distancing and wearing masks and things like that. Businesses began to open up, and we have been relatively good, I want to say. We were kind of down to less than 100 cases a day in Toronto, and Toronto is a city of about 6.5 million people. So quite a large city, which is, very handled in my view. And then since September,
Sasha, we have some connection
because
problems.
schools sort of started to come back, and many companies started to. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your line is freezing occasionally.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, now it's okay.
Okay, so let me know if that happens again.
Okay.
So after Labor Day, which is a holiday here in Canada, the schools returned and businesses started to come back to full capacity, and as a result of that, we started to see numbers increase. But we're still, somewhere around 500 to 600 cases a day for the city, which is not, a large number of cases for a city of 6.5 million people. People are remaining very vigilant. Social gatherings are, sort of discouraged for now, while business and school continues on. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that the economy can stay open as much as possible. And so far, so good. I mean, everybody in the world is having to deal with this. And I think that in Canada, our leaders have kind of done as good a job as anywhere, in my view.
Mm-hmm. What was the impact on the implication of the pandemic on the real estate market in the GTA area and in South Florida?
So let me answer the question. I'll separate the two geographies, because I think, it's been similar yet different. In the GTA, probably not unlike anywhere in the world, you had a bit of a reaction at the beginning that was uncertainty, right? I think people were uncertain around this illness and how it spreads and its severity. They were further uncertain around how to develop protocols within a professional setting. So how that impacted the real estate market was in a couple ways. So in the GTA, there was an obvious period of time kind of from mid-March to probably the end of April that there was just a lot of questions that were out there and people were nervous, right? So there wasn't a lot of buying activity. People were in lockdown, so there wasn't certainly any, visiting sites or going to open houses or sale centers. So it was relatively quiet from a sales perspective. From a construction perspective, it was a little bit chaotic in the sense that until protocols were clearly established as to how to deal with, a case of COVID on site or somebody that exhibits symptoms, how are you dealing with that? So both from how does a site move forward and what are the protocols in place around social distancing, around having people in close proximity to one another. Until that was kind of sorted out, we experienced a drop in efficiency of construction. We experienced a drop of efficiency as it related to planning things. So any projects that were in planning that required interaction or submission with the municipality or planning staff was also very challenging. But after about a month or a month and a half, things started to, become a new normal. And in the sense that people adapted, right? We developed protocols for construction sites. People knew what the social distancing requirements were. They knew, when they could be around other trades versus not be around other trades. Like a good example of that is when you're pouring concrete in a building, social distancing is very easy. So you can engage in that process without any interruption on a relative basis. Yet when you're finishing the inside of a bathroom in a condo, for example, and that has a plumber and a finishing carpenter and different trades in very close proximity, there was a bit of an efficiency lag because you couldn't do that anymore. You had to have one person in at a time, and there was these things that you had to develop. But like everywhere, we had to deal with them, and I think we dealt with them relatively well. So in Canada, I would say that there was a disruption both in the market and in the production of housing for the first month and a half or so. And then as people adjusted to that, the brokerage community and the consumers adjusted to virtual sales center launches and virtual tours of homes, and transactions started to happen again. So the market rebounded relatively quickly and has been quite strong here since probably May, and continuing on into September, both the high rise and the low rise market. Construction has been relatively stable and efficient, and planning processes have resumed, almost to their prior level of, I'll say efficiency in quotations, because those processes are never very efficient, but generally speaking, they've returned to normal. In the US, honestly, we've seen a very similar, we've been lucky to see, very uninterrupted progress. And that's by virtue of the fact that most of our properties are rental properties. So we're building rentals. We weren't relying on pre-sales and things that you would need to think about here with condominiums or homes in Toronto. So we were able to move forward with construction of all of our projects. There was relatively low interruption. And then we even started pre-leasing one of our projects in Fort Lauderdale, which completed, and we started occupying and leasing from March. So kind of right at the beginning of the pandemic. And thus far, we're over 40% occupied. It's been going above our projections, in fact. So, the real estate market has been very stable. And I think that the reality is it's an essential service, right? Like people need housing. That housing needs to be produced. That housing needs to be planned and approved. So it's had to continue. And similarly, in the markets we operate in, where there's a fundamental demand, this isn't investor speculation. This is a lot of, requirement for housing. That housing has continued to be in demand, candidly. And frankly, the last 6 or 8 months have increased that demand to some degree because interest rates have fallen. So there's been more accessibility from an affordability perspective, which has obviously helped the market. And in addition to that, you know, I think that people have saved some money over the past 6 or 8 months. You know, no holidays, no travel, many fewer dinners out, and they've accumulated some savings. And when you combine that with more accessible mortgages, there's been a good combination for the housing market.
What about, so I'll do maybe some translation to Hebrew, just in general wording. מה ששאשה מסביר לנו שבסך הכל לאחר התקופה של חודש וחצי, חודשיים, העניינים פחות או יותר חזרו לנורמליות, ככל שקשור לעניין של הוועדות תכנון, ופעילות של המחירות הייתה יציבה ואף גדלה. גם מבחינת המחירים לא ראו ירידה במחירים, להפך אפילו יש עלייה במחירים. מבחינת ההתאמה לבנייה, לקונסטרקשן, הם למדו לחיות עם הפרדה, עם קפסולות כמו שאנחנו מכירים פה בארץ, במצבים של בנייה של יציקה של בטון, כמובן זה יותר קל, ובמצבים שבקונדומיניום היה צריך להיות באותה שעה גם מי שעושה את המטבחים וגם מי שעושה את האינסטלציה וגם מי שעושה את השטיחים בבית או את הפרקט, הם למדו לעבוד בהפרדה כדי לשמור על הקפסולות האלה כדי שהם יוכלו להתקדם. וגם מבחינת ההשכרה הם הצליחו להזכיר בפרויקט שהם הוציאו בפורט לוטרדל, שנפתח ממש לפני תחילת הקורונה, 40% כבר מהבניין, מתוך 550 יחידות, זה הבניין הראשון, מתוך 2 הצליחו להזכיר. Sasha, another question about the value adds, both in Montreal and Houston, due to the fact that people working less, or some of them got unemployed or relief for vacation, what the collection of rent look like in the project, what you're expecting, what was the impact there, if at all, and how does it interfere with the progress of the value add plan for the future?
Sure. So I'll comment on our Canadian portfolio first. So separating it into 2 different things, one being, as you mentioned, collections and you know, stability. The second being with our value add program, which is a very active strategy. So with regard to collections and stability, in Quebec, the province where Montreal and our Quebec City assets are located, as well as one in Gatineau, there was assistance, right? So the provincial government made available to renters some support, and of course that helped with people's ability to pay rent. We were generally above, you know, close to 96-97% collections, and nearly fully occupied, save and except for the parts that were already vacated because of value add. So, you know, we had relatively high collections, and that continued and continues to today. So we've seen some deterioration over the past month or 2, but it's very subtle, right? So we've gone from kind of a 97 to a 96.5 or a 95.5. But what's changed now is that there was a freeze on eviction, so you weren't able to deal with a non-performing, you know, so if somebody wasn't paying you, you couldn't remove them. Now the landlord and tenant bureau has allowed for those cases to move forward. So if somebody's not paying you, you can file to have that heard at the landlord tenant board, and remove that tenant if they're not paying. What that's done is it's generally forced people to try and pay. So there was some people that at, you know, various points in times would, well, I can't pay you, and then, you know, you serve them with their paperwork and all of a sudden they pay you. So we've been relatively stable from a collections perspective, and that was kind of to be expected, because the reason you buy these assets, quite frankly, is that they're generally pretty acyclical. Like, they're not, in great times, housing's expensive, and as a result, there's more renters in these types of assets. And in very difficult times, obviously people who could maybe afford much bigger and better at a different point are having to kind of gravitate to these types of assets. So it's kind of expected to have stability. The value add program, on the other hand, it's been more challenging, because again, we had the same challenges from a construction perspective in terms of being able to move forward with turnover of some of these units. But more importantly than that, there hasn't been as much mobility, right? Because with lockdown, people are only trying to stay put, right? They're not moving from one place to another unless they have to. So between that and the student population that generally has not resumed full in-person classes, and I'm talking not about students below high school, I'm talking about university students, that's had an impact on vacancy, right? Because, obviously it's been leased as quickly because of the mobility. So leasing is generally down. So, we have to deal with some element of vacancy in the portfolio. But, we're also feeling as though the stability was the primary concern, because I think that we have the ability to kind of continue and ultimately catch up to where we wanted to be on our value add program over time. But right now, the main consideration was to make sure that tenants stayed and paid. So that's what we had done kind of across the portfolio. So our performance has been relatively good on in general in Canada. In the United States, it's been the same story. We've really focused on maintaining stability and occupancy levels high and payment levels high. If you remember, that project pays a yield of about 5.2%, and it was kind of meant to escalate over time. For the immediate term, it's staying at 5.2% because we're not able to escalate rents at the same level through this time. But that's a very short-term phenomenon in our minds. But we've been able to collect our rents. We're in the 98th percentile in collections, which is normal. Like, I think people maybe don't understand that it's never 100%, because you always have a provision for people that are, not paying, and then you deal with them, right? You take them to the board, you remove them. But generally speaking, that's nearly full collections in Houston. And then our value add program. Sorry?
In Houston, did the government apply a help program too, or only in Canada?
There was no assistance that was directly to renters, but there was a federal program called the Paycheck Protection Plan that a lot of companies got access to, and as a result, there wasn't as much layoffs and things like that. At least in our little area, where our asset is located, it's also kind of in the healthcare area, like it's near hospitals and rehabilitation facilities and things like that. So those jobs have been relatively unaffected. So for that reason, we didn't really see all that much of an impact. Like we've actually been able to, if you look at our rent roll on renewals, we've been able to increase rents on renewals. Where we're kind of falling a little further behind, like we talked about in Montreal and in Quebec, is on the value add program, because there's just not enough mobility at the moment to be as rolled as it once was. So what we need to do is kind of almost pause for a period of time and then catch up later. But that's one of the benefits of these types of assets, is that you can pause and have the stability and focus on the stability, and then catch up a little bit later in the program. And why that's, if you think about how you realize value in these projects when you've kind of completed your value add program and you're selling them on a cap rate at a point in time and based on an income stream at that point in time. So what's important is to look at the plan over the long term and make sure that, you know, even though there's periods of time where you have to kind of change your strategy based on what's happening in the world, that you have enough flexibility in this type of program where you can resume at the right time and catch up to where you expect it to be over time.
אוקיי, אני אתרגם קצת לעברית. החברה לא חוותה בעיות בגבייה במונטריאול, בסביבות ה-95-96%, לא משהו שהם לא מכירים. יש גם תוכנית בקנדה של הממשלה שעוזרת לסוחרים במידה והם מתקשים, וגם אלה שקצת חשבו שהם מתקשים הצליחו להתגבר על הבעיות ולגבות את שכר הדירה. ביוסטון 98% מהסוחרים שילמו את שכר הדירה, מה שמראה לנו על יציבות בפרויקטים האלה, שזה הייעוד של הפרויקטים האלה, גם בזמנים טובים וגם בזמנים קשים. הפרויקטים האלה מוכיחים את עצמם כפרויקטים יציבים, והפרויקט ביוסטון גם עמד ביעדים שהציב לעצמו מבחינה של חלוקה שנתית. מזכיר לכם, בארצות הברית יש חלוקות שנתיות, בקנדה אין חלוקות שנתיות, זה בגלל המימון הבנקאי השונה שיש בין שתי הארצות, וזה לזמן אחר. Sasha, as far as the ex-social projects in the US, the community social projects, did you feel any change due to COVID in this project as far as the demand, as far as the occupancy, and so on?
The short answer is no. In some cases, it actually got slightly better, and I realize that sounds very counterintuitive, but initially, when the pandemic started, we got a lot of questions about particularly social living and co-living and saying, wow, like why would, you know, how can somebody, is that going to be an impact? Because in the pandemic, how does living with a roommate work? People need to be isolated and that kind of thing. The fact of the matter is that, you know, this is an affordability play in the sense that what co-living is essentially taking the process of adults living with roommates, right? Which happens in many, many expensive cities, young adults primarily. And we're just automating it and making it very simple. So in most cases, people who live with roommates in big cities do so out of necessity, not so much by choice. They need to access affordable living and they need to split that cost. So that equation hasn't changed, right? So just because there's a pandemic, it's not that the person was choosing between, hey, do I want to live with a roommate or not? They were living with a roommate no matter what. All we've done is kind of take that process and professionalize it and institutionalize it. So rather than Nir and I going and you know, rooming together, which by the way, I don't think Nir and I would be compatible as roommates. A lovely person, but we're very different. But the fact of the matter is that people were doing that regardless, and you know, our product was really a great solution because it's professionally cleaned, it's professionally managed, it has all the right protocols in place. So in fact, people gravitated to this product, and what we ended up seeing was in our asset in Miami, collections were high. They were in the 90% range. The asset's fully stabilized. We didn't see any increase in vacancy, and our rents remained high, and they were at a bit of a premium to the rest of the market. In our Fort Lauderdale project, which we had just completed construction of the first tower, and we started leasing it when the pandemic started, we switched to a virtual strategy, obviously, with our leasing, virtual tours, a lot of multimedia, a lot of, you know, sort of digital engagement. And what we were able to do was, you know, continue the leasing velocity. And as of the end of September, we were over 41% leased, which is ahead of our schedule. And on a per square foot basis, we're ahead of our pro forma. So we've actually seen, and some of the anecdotal evidence we have is, we've in fact seen people from other states who have been told that they can work from home permanently or indefinitely, who may live in a state where it's cold, so it's not as nice as Florida, or they live in a state that has higher income taxes than the state of Florida, have decided, you know what, if I can work from home for the next year or the next, however long my employers hold me, I can move to Miami or Fort Lauderdale, pay less income tax, live in a sunny environment, and they're not looking to move and buy because they want to see if they like it. So they'll rent for a year or two. So we've been the beneficiary of people that are making those type of moves in South Florida. So the fact that the state has lower income tax, the fact that it's obviously desirable from a weather and sort of lifestyle perspective, and the fact that there's also a lot of job growth there has helped us. And so far, the assets in our social living platforms are performing either on plan or better in most cases, in all cases, in fact.
Okay. So, מה שסשה מסביר שלמרות הנגיף, המגורים המשותפים או הקונספט של מגורים משותפים ממשיך להיות חזק, גם במיימי, גם בפורט לוטרדל, הם לא חוו ירידות בביקוש או במחירים, להפך, הפרויקטים האלה יש להם ביקוש גבוה והמחירים לא יורדים, ובכלל הקונספט הזה הוא קונספט שהוא מאוד מבוקש ומאוד מצליח, גם בגלל האזור שהוא נמצא בו, המחיר יותר נמוך, מזג אוויר טוב, אנשים עוברים לגור שם, young professionals מה שנקרא, עוברים לגור שם ומחפשים את הצורה הזו של החיים, ובסך הכל הם לא חוו האטה עקב נגיף הקורונה. Moving to the next question, Sasha, where is Braybrook seeing opportunities in development, in value adds, or in build to rent?
So, here's again, this is an interesting question. I get this question a lot, and the answer is that we are seeing the opportunities in the same place that we were seeing the opportunities 8 months ago. And I don't mean to diminish, obviously, the severity of a global pandemic, and I certainly don't mean to say that there's been no impact, but the impact is not a long-term impact in our estimation. And as a result of that, when you're buying development sites, you're doing so with a long-term perspective, because in many cases you're buying something that requires a planning period, and it requires, design and sales if you're doing a condo, or construction if you're doing a rental building. And by the time this is completed and ready for occupancy, or in the case of a Toronto condo, ready for sales, a lot of time has passed. So it's difficult sometimes for investors. I think a common fallacy investors have is they base investment decisions on today's circumstances rather than tomorrow's circumstances. And I think that, investing successfully requires some forecasting and some foresight. And what we try to do is look at this period of time and try to understand whether there's systemic change that is resulting from this, right? So what I mean by that is or has COVID caused a structural change in Toronto's demographic? Has COVID caused a structural change in our supply-demand equation as it relates to the availability of housing versus the amount of demand for housing? The answer to that is no. Now, has COVID caused a period of time where people's finances might be, less predictable, or where there may be an economic impact, like a recession? The answer is yes, but you have to look at that for today and its point in time. So the best way that I can describe that to you, Nir, is the fundamental drivers that have led us to want to buy high rise in core areas of Toronto, low rise in the southern Ontario, whether it's the greater Toronto area or the greater Golden Horseshoe, which is a little further expanded area, are the same. Those fundamentals remain intact. And the best way I can describe it is, if you were to tell me today, Sasha, you can have an approved condo site, it's ready to go, you can buy it now, and you have to start sales within the next 12 months because of where you're at in the planning cycle, I don't know that I would do that, because I do think that there's a little bit of cloud over the next 12 months, right? In terms of jobs, in terms of what will happen with lockdowns, in terms of stimulus, in terms of what happens after a vaccine. Those things are relative unknowns. So if I could choose, now there's a lot of things that we own already, so we have to make decisions and we have to read the market real time. But if I could choose today, because I'm buying something today, would I buy something that I need to launch in the next 12 months? The answer is probably not. Not because I don't believe in the long-term fundamentals of the market, because the same drivers are valid. It's because I would like to have the benefit of time in order to be able to restore a level of normal into this market. And what I mean by that is human beings are either going to have to, one of two things are going to happen. Either we're going to have a solution to COVID, whatever that is, whether that's a vaccine or some effective therapy or whatever that case is, or we're going to have no valid solution and we're going to have to figure out how to live life in an altered fashion. Either way, we're going to move forward, and cities are going to exist, and people are going to need jobs, and they're going to need roofs over their heads. So, you know, I believe that over a period of time, there's a much higher than not likelihood that we will see normal or some slightly altered version of that going forward. And I think cities like Toronto and Southern Ontario, and I guess more broadly speaking, Canada, for the same reasons that we attracted high levels of immigration in January 2020 before COVID, and for the same reasons that we had economic prosperity and job diversity and all of the things that made Canada a great country and this region a very sought after region globally, are still there and they're still intact. It's just a question of distribution of time. And the best example of that to me is immigration. I was on a panel yesterday and there was a lot of alarmist people saying, well, immigration's down and, you know, that's a big driver for Canada. The federal government doesn't make immigration decisions over, you know, 1 year increments. They have a plan that's a 20-year plan, and they have targets over 20 years in terms of the number of people that they need to come into Canada for us to sustain our level of growth and economic prosperity. So as a result of that, whatever it is that we lose in 2020 and maybe 2021, we will likely gain in 2022 and 2023. It's no different than in the financial crisis where we had several condo sites that were in sales in 2008, and then all of a sudden sales stopped because, you know, obvious reasons, right? Banks stopped lending, there was a lot of financial turmoil, people's portfolios were down. There was a number of reasons that the market stalled for a period of a year and a half. And then by 2010 and 2011, we saw a record number of sales. So what does that mean to me? If you listen to the media, it was lowest number of sales in Toronto history. The Toronto, you know, housing market is falling apart because look at how low the sales are. Historically, we've never seen sales this low. And then in 2010, it's overheated. It's a record number of sales. And to somebody who's smart enough to look at those numbers for what they are and apply a more even distribution, you just look at it and say, of course, there was a lower number of sales. We were in the middle of a financial collapse. And then in 2010, all that happened was people that were going to buy in 08 and 09 felt confident enough to buy in 2010 and 11. So if you applied those numbers across a 4-year time frame, you would have had about the exact number of condo and home sales that you would expect, just distributed differently. So I feel the same way about immigration. I feel the same way about the overall demand for housing. So today, if you read newspapers in Toronto, they'll say, you know, the rental market is performing poorly because rents are down 10%. Well, if you have no schools, we have 3 major universities in the downtown core and none of them are going to class. If you have every major bank and financial institution that employs tens of thousands of people in the downtown core close their offices, then logically, people who live in an expensive city like Toronto because they have to, because they work there or go to school there, are probably going to go live elsewhere. They're going to go live with mom and dad again, or they're going to go live in a neighboring town that's not costing them as much money until they have to return to the city of Toronto. So logically, yes, there will be a lag in today rents and today pricing. But if you're making an investment that is expected to return capital based on assumptions of tomorrow, and you're letting what's happening today cloud that decision, you're going to be a very unsuccessful investor. And I don't say that in a facetious way. It's just that the way that we have to understand this, you have to look at long-term trends. You have to look at policies as they're created for the long term. And if you believe that what's happening with COVID-19 has permanently, systemically changed the way that people will interact and the way that cities will continue to evolve, okay, then we might be having a different conversation. Our belief here is that that is not a systemic change. It's a point in time. And another good example for me of that is offices. You know, you hear and read all the time, well, people will never return to offices. Look how efficient you can work from home and look how great it is. I've got news for you. I've spoken to several CEOs of large companies, companies of our size, banks, you know, industrial manufacturing, all different types. And there will be a return to office. In fact, there's a higher demand right now in some cases for industrial space and office space. And I believe that that trend will continue. So cities will prevail in the sense of people wanting to live in cities, people needing to live in cities. And as a result of that, the things that we buy, whether it's in the US or in Canada, the same fundamental drivers that existed prior to this pandemic will survive this pandemic. So that's assumptions that we make and over what time frames.
We have some problem with the lines. I will translate for now. מה שסטאשה בעצם אומר שההסתכלות של החברה או ההסתכלות שלו בצורה שהם מנתחים את זה היא הסתכלות ארוכת טווח מעבר להשפעות מיידיות שיש על השוק מבחינה של שכירות או מבחינה של כמה אנשים מגיעים לעבודה במשרדים. ברגע שמסתכלים על הדברים בצורה ארוכת טווח ומאמינים שהעולם בסופו של דבר יחזור להתנהל ולהתנהג כפי שהכרנו לפני הפנדמיה, שזה אומר שאנשים יחזרו לעבודה בצורה סדירה ויצטרכו לגור בעיר, ואנשים כן יחזרו לעבוד במשרדים, כי חברות גדולות רוצות ודורשות שהעובדים שלהם בכל זאת יעבדו מהמשרדים. השוק בסופו של דבר יחזור לנורמליות, וככל שאנחנו מסתכלים לטווח ארוך בפרויקטים שלנו, הם לא רואים שינוי מהותי, והזמן הוא בעצם הידיד שלנו פה מבחינת ההשקעות, ובסופו של דבר יהיה פתרון כזה או אחר לקוביד, או שיהיה בצורה של חיסון שכולנו מקווים שיקרה, או שאנחנו פשוט נלמד איך לחיות לצד הקורונה, מה מותר לנו, מה אסור לנו, וגם עם זה החיים יחזרו לאיזשהו סוג של נורמליות. והשיקולים שלהם הם מסתכלים על הדברים באורך שהוא ארוך טווח. זה קרה להם גם ב-2008, שאנשים חשבו שהעולם הולך להתמוטט בגלל המשבר הבנקאי, ופתאום ב-2010 הייתה קפיצה מאוד מאוד גדולה בדרישה לנדלן, וגם פה הוא מאמין שאם זה היה פרויקט שהוא היה צריך למכור אותו ב-12 חודשים הקרובים, אז כן, הוא היה עושה שיקולים כאלה ואחרים, אבל מכיוון שהפרויקטים הם פרויקטים ארוכי טווח, הוא מאמין וחושב שהנורמליות תחזור והזמן יאפשר לנו לחזור בחזרה, שהשוק יקפוץ בחזרה, המחירים יעלו. גם כרגע חווים עליית מחירים ועלייה במחירות בטורונטו בחודשים האחרונים, מאז אפריל-מאי, ואנחנו מאמינים, בגלל שהשוק הזה זה שוק שתמיד אנשים ירצו לבוא לגור בו, תמיד יגיעו מהגרים לגור בו, יש גידול טבעי, הוא ימשיך וישמור על יציבות עוד שנים רבות קדימה. אנחנו קופצים עכשיו לחלק של השאלות ותשובות. Sasa, we're going to jump to question and answer. We are about time, almost an hour, so we'll go through a few questions that we received. The first question that Guy is asking, where do you see interest rates going?
Probably nowhere for the foreseeable future. I think that the government of Canada, the Bank of Canada, as well as the Fed in the United States, has been relatively, uniform in their guidance around interest rates, remain low for a long time. I mean, with all of the stimulus that has been pumped into the economies, it's to everyone's advantage to have low interest rates. I don't think inflation is a concern. Interest rates are a primary, their primary reason for moving interest rates is to control inflation. And we are not anywhere near an inflationary environment given what's happening in the world and sort of overall asset values. So, I think that we're headed for a period of time where we're going to have low interest rates, whether that's for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. Don't have the answer to that. Obviously, we'll have to adjust and read as we go. But I don't believe interest rate increases to be a near-term concern.
Okay. A second question we got from Dov. What is the chances to see an early exit in one of our projects?
Well, it depends on which one. I think that the answer is we are always looking at the potential for early exits. Our plan might be to take a project from beginning, approvals, sales, construction, and completion, milestones, assessing what our options are and whether there's been enough value realized. Is there a market for it at that point? Can we create an exit? I think it's important for people to understand, one of the things, look, we're very conscious of time, and things have taken more time. This is not something that is lost on us. This is not something that we ignore. This is something that we realize. However, it is a very fundamental part of real estate development in the sense that all of the price growth that we're seeing comes from two sides of an equation. It's not simply the demand for housing, it's also the scarcity of housing. So for all the difficulty and time it takes to get things through a process and agree on approvals with the community and with the municipalities, that creates scarcity. Because if it was easy and quick, you could produce as many homes as needed to service the demand. So the double-edged sword here is, yes, things can take a little bit longer, in some cases much longer than we anticipated, but it creates value inflection and we have the ability to execute. So for us, I believe that we feel very fortunate to be in a market, and we're already going to see this, and near your investors haven't seen this round of reporting because they're not out yet. But when we look at sort of Q4 2020 reports and compare many of them to Q2 or our last half reports, we'll see a lot of progress in many different projects. Both the market has improved, so prices have improved and margins have improved. We've achieved many milestones in planning. So all of these things are very important. And to answer the question very directly, at every milestone, we will look at the opportunity to exit, and if it makes sense for us with the return we can generate relative to the time, relative to the risk that's remaining, and we'll make those determinations.
Okay. Yossi is asking, how did the pandemic impact the selling prices of the real estate? You answer it partially. Can you expand a little bit about it?
Yeah, so the low-rise market has been quite good. So prices year over year have increased. In fact, prices quarter over quarter have increased. I'll attribute that to low interest rates, because one of the largest barriers as to why 2018 and 19 didn't see the same level of appreciation, in fact, from when the government came in with some of their changes in 2017, we saw a drop in low-rise prices. And the biggest change that caused this drop was the introduction of a concept here called B20, which is a 200 basis point requirement in qualifying for a mortgage. So if the posted rate of a mortgage was 3%, then in order to qualify, you had to show income to be able to support 5%. And that was a big barrier for people because what happened was when they put that rule in place, there was another 125 basis points of increase in the interest rate. So initially when they intended to put the rule in place, interest rates might have been at 2.5%, so you had to qualify at 4.5%. Well, in the meantime, interest rates went from 2.5% to 3.75% plus 200 basis points. So obviously that had a dampening effect on the market because less people were able to access affordably their desired housing. Well, when the pandemic hit, interest rates dropped dramatically. People stayed home for 6 months and saved some more money, and their stock portfolio and the value of their home was higher than it was prior to the pandemic because those asset classes stayed relatively, I mean, the stock market did this, but then it went right back to where it was and housing prices remained stable. So all of those things together was the perfect recipe for people to get back into the market because now they could access it, and we've seen prices move up. And the same has been the case on the high-rise side, albeit not as aggressively. Like we had a run up in the high-rise market that was, 20% or so year over year. And so that's leveled off. It's still positive. It's just not going at the same pace, which is fine. But the low-rise market has rebounded and is in fact increasing in value. Now, again, we can't forget that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we don't know what tomorrow holds in terms of lockdowns in the economy and, all of these factors. But for right now, we have a tremendous amount of health in our housing market, and we've seen the numbers to support that.
קצת תרגום של כמה מילים. כרגע הם חווים עליית מחירים בשוק של מחירי הבתים, בעיקר של צמודי הקרקע, ובצורה יותר מתונה של רבי הקומות. ב-2017 הייתה ירידה עקב מבחן זכאות למשכנתא שנעשה על ידי הממשלה, שהוא לא היה קיים בקנדה לפני כן, ולקח זמן עד שהשוק התרגל לקריטריון הזה. כתוצאה מכך הייתה האטה במחירות, אבל ככל שהריביות ירדו, יותר ויותר אנשים נכנסו לתחום שהם זכאים לקבל את המשכנתא לדירות או לדיור שהם רוצים, ברמה שהם רוצים, וככה השוק הזה השתפר, וכרגע אנחנו חווים גם עלייה במחירות וגם עלייה במחירים. Moving to the next question, Ron asked me, is rent control is an issue in the GTA or Montreal that can impact the projects that we're doing? And we don't hear
like the
you,
value
Sasha.
add ones primarily? Is that the question, or just generally?
Yeah, for the value adds.
So I'm just asking if the question, okay. So the impact is no different than previously because rent control has always existed. So it has nothing to do with the measures that were put in place due to the pandemic. Rent control in Toronto and Montreal for buildings that predate 1981 in their production, I think maybe 1991, I can't remember. All of our buildings are older than that. So as a result of that, there's always been rent control. So we've taken that into account in all of our projections. We're not anticipating any more growth than what the inflationary levels were. The only one thing that may have a short-term impact is that for a period of time, the province of Ontario is, they haven't passed it yet, but they're talking about freezing rents for a year. That's not the case in Quebec. So Montreal, Quebec City, Gatineau. We have one asset in Ottawa. I don't think there are any Israeli investors that are invested in that. I think it's with our institutional partner. But that may be impacted in the short term if the government decides to freeze rents for 2021. But other than that, we don't have any unanticipated effect of rent control.
מה שסשה אומר שבניינים שנבנו לפני 1991 מתחילתה היה בהם את העניין של רנט קונטרול, והם תכננו את כל הפרויקטים לפי המודל הזה. יכול להיות שיהיה מצב של הקפאה של שכר דירה, שהוא לא משהו שיהיה במונטריאול, רק באושו ששם הם משקיעים עם בנק אוף מונטריאול, השותף שלהם שהוא שותף מוסדי, ככה שזה לא משפיע על משקיעים פרטיים בכלל. And last question that Anat is asking, is there a stop in immigration to Canada due to COVID, and if so, how does it affect the residential market?
That's a good question. I get this question often. The stop in immigration to Canada or anywhere for that matter because of travel restrictions has a short-term impact, primarily on rental, right? Not so much on the demand for new housing, more in the rental market. And it's primarily the student population. We have a lot of international students that come here from China and other places, come to Toronto. That has not been nearly the same volume. But immigration, permanent immigration on the whole, is not as low as people think it is, right? I think when they read the newspaper, they assume it's zero because nobody's moving anywhere. It's not. It's probably 65% of its anticipated level. So much like the example I gave you around 2008 and 9 relative to 10 and 11 during the financial crisis, where you saw many fewer condo purchases in 08 and 09, and then you had well above normal for 2010 and 11. On average, they were right kind of where you needed to be. I anticipate immigration to be very similar. I think that, you know, our federal government, we rely on immigration at a federal level and at a city level to be able to grow. Canada is one of the strongest economic countries, yet we only have a population, and that, you know, people in Canada are getting married later, they're having less children. So our ability to grow and prosper economically relies heavily on new people coming into Canada. That plan is a 20-year plan that the government has laid out from 2020 to 2040, where they're expecting their target is 340,000 people per year into Canada. Of those, about half of them end up kind of in the greater Toronto area. So what we have lost or will lose in 2020 and maybe 2021, I expect 2022 and 2023 to make up for them as well going forward. Because I think that the things that drew people to Canada, for all the reasons, right? The stability, the social, you know, acceptance, the diversity, the job growth are still intact. And I still think that people will come here. Probably when you look at what's happening in the United States, you know, there's an argument that there's more people that are now gravitating to Toronto than they are to a place like New York or Chicago or Boston. So all of this to say that we're ready to ramp up those levels again. I think that this goes back to my earlier point around, you know, you have to look to the future and not so much the circumstances of today. So that Yorkville project, as an example, we have about a 2.5-year planning period before we're even approved to sell condos. So the immigration levels of today are less relevant to me than my forecast for immigration levels in 3, 4, 5 years from now. And I feel very comfortable that those will resume and in fact strengthen over the next number of years.
אז מה שסשה בעצם אומר שההשפעה היא השפעה תקופתית עכשיו, ועדיין יש הגירה וההגירה תמשיך ותעלה בעתיד, והוא לא רואה את ההגירה כמשהו שיעצור את הביקוש. עיקר הביקוש מתרכז בהגירה, בהתחלה לפחות, בתחום של הסחירות, ולכן הוא לא רואה איזושהי השפעה מהותית בטווח הארוך מבחינת המחירים או מבחינת שוק המגורים. אני שוב מזכיר לכם, מי שעדיין מעוניין לשבועיים הקרובים, יש לנו את האפשרות לפרויקט קצר של 2.8 חודשים במיימי, פרויקט של מגורים קהילתיים. נשמח אם תרצו לבחון אותו ולהצטרף. Sasha, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate the time you took. We saved you the flight, the hotel expenses, etc., etc. אני מתנצל, I apologize for having a bad line every once in a while. We have some technical issues. That's the challenge with, I guess, international conference. And we were happy to host you here.
Thank you. And the good news, I guess, with technical difficulties is now that I have no choice but to fly to Tel Aviv for my next one.
Thank you very much. The weather is great here. We are about 30 Celsius and it's starting to be cold in Toronto. So I'm sure you want to replace the weather in about a few weeks time. And yes. So תודה רבה לכולם. Thank you very much to you all. Shalom to Toronto and shalom from Netanya. And חג סוכות שמח לכולם. תודה רבה שהייתם איתנו. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.